Welcome to Face Towards Zion. It's been a while since I posted, since the book of Job to be specific. Today there are quite a few Come Follow Me videos that are available, and some of them are pretty good. My videos haven't received the reception of others, and so I haven't posted that much. This week's lesson has some really neat things in it, and I wanted to throw out some ideas that I don't think will be in other videos. Ultimately, this week's video is about the Last Supper, a very important event. I used the most famous painting for this, Leonardo da Vinci's fresco, or some call it a tempera, on the wall of the Santa Maria delle Grazie church in Milan, Italy. This fresco is considered one of the world's greatest pieces of art. It's not a painting, it's a fresco. A fresco is basically colored plaster that is applied to and becomes a part of a wall. It's almost an extension of the times when ancients would carve petroglyphs on rock walls. During the Renaissance, it reached its zenith, and it is not near as popular today as it was then. Da Vinci's version of the Last Supper has maintained interest due to its natural beauty, but also it is pretty controversial. Some of the controversies include things such as the individual seated to the right of Christ is often debated as to whether it is John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, or is it Mary Magdalene. It is the only figure wearing a necklace or a pendant. At least in Da Vinci's day, men didn't wear necklaces. This individual is seated at Christ's right hand, the most honored and preferred place. If you look close, it seems to resemble the Mona Lisa that Da Vinci would paint 5 years later. Next to John, going to our left, is Peter, then Judas Iscariot. Notice in the painting that Judas is the only one with dark skin and a crooked nose, a prejudicial way to portray Jews both before and since. Judas has knocked over the salt, bringing bad luck. Directly in front of Judas is a bag of money. Could that be the 30 pieces of silver? And in his glass is milk, not the wine that everybody else is drinking. Could this mean that Judas is not only outside the inner circle, but the wine of forgiveness is not available for Judas? Judas is the only one to have his elbow on the table, and his head is vertically the lowest of anyone in the painting. Look close at Peter, and he is holding a knife, meaning he is protecting Jesus from his attackers. Going further from Christ's right, which is our left, we have Andrew, James the Lesser, and Bartholomew. To Christ's left, who is in the shape of an equilateral triangle and is reaching for bread, is Thomas, then James the Greater, and Philip. Note also that Jesus is framed by the window with a circular arc above it, similar to that of a halo. Thomas holds up his index finger, which is an allusion to Christ rising from the dead. Remember, he is the one who won't believe until he touches the risen Christ. It is also controversial, as a raised finger is the symbol of the Priory of Sion or even the Illuminati, which has Masonic overtures. There are always lots of conspiracy theories if you want to believe them. In the final group of 3 are Matthew, Judas Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. There is a lot to be said about this painting, including figures and meanings, the M and V shapes. However, this video isn't about the painting. We can simply admire it as an incredible work of art. This week's lesson covers Matthew 26, Mark 14, and John 13. Next week's lesson covers John 14 through 17, and the following week covers Luke 22 and John 18. So we have 3 weeks of lessons, but they are all really covering one day in Christ's life, and they kind of weave in and out depending on the gospel writer. Remember, each gospel by itself is self-contained and is meant to provide different insights than the others, all on the same events. The day we are looking at is Thursday, or Maundy Thursday, as some call it. The word Maundy means the ceremony of washing the feet. Now, the timeline of the Holy Week is confusing. Contributing to the confusion is that the Jews kept time different than we do today. So the beginning of their Thursday is our Wednesday night, etc. So what happened during the Holy Week? I looked at the internet and downloaded a few diagrams of different timelines, and if you look closely at the timelines shown on this page, they all have the crucifixion on a different day. The traditional day is that Christ was crucified on Friday and rose on Sunday. However, there are arguments that he died on Thursday. The timeline on the lower left of what is shown argues he died on Wednesday. Part of the problem is the identification of the Sabbath. Everyone agrees that the Jewish Sabbath was Saturday. However, the Passover is also considered a Sabbath or a holy day. What day of the week did that fall on? Using calendaring software, you can go back and compare the Jewish calendar to our calendar today and determine what day Passover was on. The problem is, no one can agree on which year Christ was crucified. You can find arguments for any and every year from about AD 27 through AD 35. It can be very confusing. On top of the confusing timeline, we are covering 3 chapters, which crosses multiple days. One approach would be to study it all out and lay out the different arguments. That isn't my purpose. What I would like to do is to discuss what the sacrament, which was instituted during the Last Supper, what does that mean to us today? I would then like to do a fun exercise and use Lean Six Sigma tools to give insights onto the topic of whether or not the Last Supper was a Passover meal. If you are like me, some of my earliest memories are of kindergarten. I remember having my blanket and eating some milk and cookies. Sometimes, especially when we are young, we think the sacrament is kind of like a break from the normal meeting. You sing some neat songs and get a treat. But that is not what the sacrament means. During General Conference in October 2014, the realization of the importance of the sacrament impacted me when Cheryl Esplin spoke on this topic. Now, at the time, she was the second counselor in the primary general presidency. I was expecting her to talk about the primary, or children, or how special our children are, something along those lines. I was surprised when she began her talk with, quote, "A group of young women once asked me, 'What do you wish you had known when you were our age?' Unquote." That she started her talk out discussing young women instead of younger children kind of surprised me. But then I started to think, if you were asked this question, how would you respond? Perhaps I would want to talk about Christ and his example, perhaps even the atonement. Perhaps I would talk about the restoration of the gospel and what it means today, perhaps even the role of the Book of Mormon. But I wasn't ready for what she said next. Sister Esplin said, "If I were to answer that question now, I would include this thought. I wish when I was your age, I had understood the significance of the sacrament better than I did." With all of the issues going on in the world today, she said she would want young women to better understand the significance of the sacrament. While I enjoyed the remainder of her talk, I pondered on her thoughts and the role of the sacrament. There are a lot of approaches we can take on understanding the sacrament. One, for example, would be what the symbols represent. If it were me, I'd be inclined to use unleavened bread, which are kind of like crackers, and then either wine or substitute grape juice. That may be a better symbolism of the atonement. But remember, 2 years ago when we studied the Doctrine and Covenants in section 27, Joseph Smith went to get some wine for the sacrament to be taken after they confirmed Emma as a member of the church. When an angel stopped him and said, "For behold, I say unto you, that it mattereth not what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink when ye partake of the sacrament, if it so be that ye do it with an eye single to my glory." So it really doesn't matter that the bread is unleavened. Another approach to the sacrament would be to better understand why Christ and the apostles were undergoing a Passover meal. What was the symbolism of the unleavened bread, the 4 glasses of wine, and even the question of, why is this night different than any other night? Truly, Maundy Thursday was different than any other night. Those are all great topics to study, if you have the time. But I really want to tie the sacrament to the covenants we make. We initially make special covenants at baptism, and then, if we choose, we make greater covenants with greater promises in the temple. When someone gets ready for baptism, there is a process that is followed. Once they are ready, they have a baptismal interview. See section 31.2.3 of the General Handbook for the process of the baptismal interview. Basically, the purpose for a baptismal interview is to ensure that the individual properly understands the purposes of baptism, understands the covenant they are making, and they are committed to live by them. Included is a process of repentance and the commitment to following certain commandments, specifically the word of wisdom, the law of chastity, the law of tithing, and of keeping the Sabbath day holy. If the individual is committed and fully understands this commitment, then they are recommended to be baptized. During the service, the individual states that they are willing to take upon them the name of the Son, always remember him, keep the commandments which he has given them. Then the Lord allows that his Spirit to always be with them. And these are pretty neat covenants. What does it mean to take upon you the name of Christ? When you are born in this life, you have parents. At birth, you take upon you the family name. You are now part of that family. You have legal rights of that family. When you are born of the water of baptism, you become part of Christ's family. In essence, he now becomes your father. You have certain rights with him. Some may even use the phrase that you are justified. What does it mean to always remember him? Interestingly, in the prayer on the sacramental bread, it says that by partaking, we are willing to always remember him. The prayer on the water says this witnesses or shows that you are actually doing that they may witness unto thee, O God, the eternal Father, that they do always remember him. The prayer on the bread contains all three of the covenants, where the water only reiterates the remembrance. Note that the prayer on the bread doesn't include taking upon us his name or keeping the commandments, but it says we are remembering him with this act. What does it mean to be willing to keep his commandments? Does this mean you will always be perfect and never make even one mistake? That would be a pretty tough task. However, think of the covenant. When you don't live up to your side of the covenant, is the covenant then broken? But the Lord, knowing we will not be perfect, set up a path called repentance, where we can repent of our sins. Remember, this is part of the baptismal interview. And this is where the sacrament comes in. When we worthily partake of the sacrament, certain things happen. Mormon 9:29. See that you are not baptized unworthily. See that ye partake not of the sacrament of Christ unworthily. I think that when we partake of the sacrament, we are symbolically placed back into the baptismal interview. Have we repented of our mistakes? Are we willing to keep the commandments? If those answers are yes, then I think we are worthily partaking of the sacrament. Then when we partake of the sacrament, we then come back into this covenantal relationship. The covenant is restored. Partaking of the sacrament puts you in the same state as you were when you were originally baptized. Taking the sacrament is like being baptized over again. And I think this is why Sister Esplin said that understanding this entire process is one of the most important things we can know. The sacrament is not break time. It's being placed back into a covenantal relationship. This is what our young men and young women need to know, and may I add, our experienced and even old men and women need to know. This is the process, is what Christ initiated in the Last Supper, and this is what Da Vinci's painting is really all about. Now, what does it mean to always have his Spirit to be with them? Let's back up to earlier in the Gospels. I wish I would have done a video on the parables of Jesus. Of course, Christ uses parables throughout the Gospels. The lesson from Matthew 13 focuses on some parables. In this one chapter, we are given the parables of the sower, the wheat and the tares, the grain of mustard seed, the leaven, the treasure hidden in the field, the pearl of great price, and the net cast into the sea. We often look at these individually, but what does the parable of the wheat and the tares mean? What does the parable of the pearl of great price mean? And it's very helpful to look at them this way. But I think it is very constructive to look back at these parables as a whole. What is the common theme in these parables? If you read carefully, these parables all begin with, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then the parable goes on. In order to understand these, we need to ask ourselves, what exactly is the kingdom of heaven? If we can't define this concept, then how can we understand the parables? In the time of Christ, I think the Jewish people defined the kingdom of heaven as being a movement that would come and drive off Rome. Israel would then be set up, and through that movement, the blessings of Abraham would be extended to all the earth. Israel would be the focal point of the earth. Clearly, that is not what the kingdom of heaven meant. What is it today? Is it this movement that will come and usher in the Lord's second coming, which will bring peace and millennial reign? Is it the culmination of all this, which is the celestial kingdom? Is it today's church that through the ordinances of the church you can qualify for these blessings, and so the kingdom of heaven is the mechanism to receive these blessings? Is it a personal accomplishment of becoming a Zion person and worthy to live in Christ's presence? Good questions, but is it any of these? Think back of Christ's time. Did the kingdom of heaven fail? Was it ever established in the first place? Did the kingdom of heaven actually come? Think back to the lesson I gave on the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. There we talked about the temple, and I said that the purpose of the temple is, quote, a place where we can go to make covenants and symbolically learn how to enter into the Lord's presence as families, unquote. Think about the temple. Are we not taught the process to enter into the Lord's presence? Could you define the kingdom of heaven as being in Christ's presence? When Christ came down to earth, was not God himself here among the people? If you would have been around him, then you would have been in his presence. That is what the temple teaches us, how to be in his presence. So if you would have been alive at that time and followed him and been in his presence, would you not have been in the kingdom of heaven? If the kingdom of heaven is being in the Lord's presence, then are we denied that today? Can we be in his spiritual presence instead of necessarily his physical presence? If his spirit is with us, are we not then in his presence, and are we not then in the kingdom of heaven at that moment? As we partake of the sacrament, we commit to do certain things, remember? Take upon us his name, always remember him, keep the commandments which he has given us, and we receive a blessing, that they may always have his spirit to be with them. If we have his spirit with us, are we then in the kingdom of heaven? With his spirit, we will know who we are, what we are to do, how we are to serve. We can be an instrument in his hand, and we receive that promise when we worthily partake of the sacrament. So we can ask, what would you be willing to give in order to be in this relationship with the Lord? If that relationship is like finding a treasure in a field, would you be willing to sell all that you have to purchase that field? If you found a great pearl, would you sell all that you have for that pearl? Would you be willing to give all that you have to have a relationship with the Lord? The sacrament reestablishes this relationship. I think Sister Esplin was correct when she said that if we understand one thing, it would be the importance of the sacrament. To me, I think this is the meaning of this week's lesson. So if that is how important the sacrament is, let's learn a little bit about the Last Supper. There is so much to learn. However, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole that may not be essential to our salvation, but I think is interesting. I've always had a question about the Last Supper. Was the Last Supper a Passover meal? And the question has an easy answer. The answer is yes, it was a Passover meal. How do we know this? The answer is in the Scriptures. The Scriptures tell us that this is true. Matthew says, "Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The Master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover." Pretty straightforward, isn't it? The 26th chapter of Matthew then gives the story of the Last Supper. Mark says, "And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare that thou mayest eat the Passover? And he sendeth forth 2 of his disciples, and saith unto them, Go ye into the city, and there ye shall meet you a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him, and wheresoever he shall go in, say ye to the good men of the house, The Master saith, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will shew you a large upper room furnished and prepared. there make ready for us. And his disciples went forth and came into the city and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. Again, pretty straightforward. Except now Mark gives an episode of meeting a man carrying a pitcher of water. They follow this man to a house and get ready for the Passover meal. And the story in Luke is similar. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed, and he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. And ye shall say unto the goodman of the house, The master saith unto thee, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall shew you a large upper room furnished, there make ready. And they went and found as he had said unto them, and made ready the Passover. And when the house was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. That's Luke 22, 7 through 14. Now we are told the 2 disciples mentioned in Mark are Peter and John. And we also have the story of finding a man carrying a pitcher of water. So if it is so straightforward, then why do I bring up the question? It's because the book of John gives a completely different picture. John says, Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come that he should depart out of the world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So with John, it is before the feast, meaning the Passover meal hadn't happened yet. Chapters 13 through 17 then give details about what happened during and after the meal. Chapter 18 then tells of going to the garden and the rest of Christ. Verse 28 says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Did you catch what happened? After Gethsemane, after they took Christ to Caiaphas, they didn't go into the hall to defile themselves, as they had not yet eaten the Passover. If they had not yet eaten the Passover, then what had happened earlier at the Last Supper? John even goes on. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth, and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover. And about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, Behold your king. John 19:13 and 14. And they took Christ and crucified him. So with John's timing, Christ is crucified at the same time they are killing the Passover lamb. This is a very symbolic move. The Passover lamb is a symbol of Christ, who is the real Passover lamb. It is through his blood that we are saved. So then, who is right? The Synoptic Gospel writers or John? Bible scholars disagree one with another and don't come to a definitive answer, or they skip the question entirely. But can the question be answered? Most scholars will ask why and then debate among themselves. Interestingly, to find the answer to the question, one doesn't need to ask why, but instead ask the 5 whys. What do I mean by the 5 whys? Whenever an accident occurs or something goes wrong in business, an investigation is warranted. One of the first steps is to determine what went wrong. The goal is to determine the root cause. If something is fixed and it wasn't the root cause, then the issue can occur again. You need to fix the root cause. Finding the root cause can be a little tricky. There are various ways to do it, but a very common way is to use a tool called the 5 whys. The goal here is you start with a problem statement, basically a summary of what went wrong, and then you ask, why did that happen? Once that is determined, you will then ask, why did that happen? The theory is that by the time you ask the question the 5th time, you will then find the root cause. This sounds easy, but in practice it can be difficult. Many times when you ask why, the search goes a number of different ways. You usually want to look at all of them, but there is usually a common sense answer. For each why, you need to make the solution of that actionable. If you are not careful, you may end up concluding that it happened this way because that is the way God made the world. You won't be able to change that. Other times, a possible solution might be that a green Martian came down and did something. This also doesn't make sense and is highly doubtful. You have to stay on top of the answers at each step and try to think of the most logical answer. So for the problem at hand, the problem statement would be something like, the Synoptic Gospels say that the Last Supper occurred as a Passover meal, but the Gospel of John says the Passover occurred later. Who is correct? And some commentaries will then try to answer this question, while many commentaries just skip this altogether. Some side with the Synoptic authors, others with John. S. Kent Brown, in the Brigham Young University New Testament Commentary series titled The Testimony of Luke, he says, quote, whether the Last Supper is a Passover meal or a pre-Passover occasion forms one of the most difficult problems for students of the New Testament. To date, this difficulty defies solution, unquote. Well, instead of skipping past it, let's apply a 5 why analysis and see if we can gain additional insights. Interestingly, my answer to this question focused not on addressing the earlier problem statement, but on another similar problem that occurs at the same time. Answering that question will answer whether or not the Last Supper was a Passover meal. Remember a few slides back, I quoted Luke 22, 7 through 13, where the Lord told Peter and John that they would find a man, quote, bearing a pitcher of water, unquote, and they were to follow him. Now this little story is interesting. What would happen if Peter and John went into the city and ran into a bunch of men carrying pitchers of water? Somehow Christ knew that there would only be one man carrying water, and Peter and John would easily recognize this sign. So let's tweak our problem statement a little and restate it. How does the story of the man carrying a pitcher of water impact our conclusion on whether the Last Supper was a Passover meal as it is contradicted in the Gospels? Let's phrase our first why question as, why did the Lord ask his apostles to find a man carrying a pitcher of water? Wouldn't the town be full of men carrying pitchers of water? And that question has been asked before and fortunately has an easy answer. At the time of Christ and even before throughout the history of the Hebrew people, it was their custom that women carried the water and not the men. Water would usually be found at a well, and it was a woman's job to go to the well and fetch the water. Remember the biblical stories when Christ was in Samaria. Who came to get the water? That story is usually referred to as the woman at the well. Moses, after wandering into the desert, found a well, and who came to get water? Exodus 2 tells us that it was Jethro's daughters that found him. Abraham's servant, when he went to get a wife for Isaac, goes to the well and asks the Lord to give him a sign that the damsel who waters his camels will be the right one. And it was Rebekah who did this. Remember all of those stories? So it was their custom that women go to the well and women carry the water. And others have came to the same conclusion. Again, as Kent Brown says, the man will catch the attention of Peter and John because women normally carry such pitchers, unquote. Once we get this answer, we usually stop here, but let's keep going. For my whys, I like to state the issue and then ask why. So our second why can be, so if it was customary that women obtain and carry water, why was a man carrying a pitcher of water? And here's where people often get uncomfortable by continuing to ask why. In this instance, we are not told. We don't know why a man was carrying a pitcher of water. It could be that he was inspired to do so. But would you do something that was not socially acceptable on a whim? Clearly, if you understood the Spirit, then you would. But often God works through normal, everyday events, and there could be another reason. Why else would a man be carrying a pitcher of water? The most logical answer is because this man lived in a household that didn't include women. He was the only person in the household, or he lived only with other men. Would you not agree that that is a very logical answer to this question? Let's continue with our 5 whys. The third why. Why, during the 1st century AD, would a man live in a household that did not include women? Now we start to get into a culture different from our own. In our current culture, it is rare that a man lives alone. However, their culture is different from ours. In their culture, they lived much more as extended families than we do today. Today, once you leave home, then you create your own home and don't move back in with your parents. However, with the price of homes being so high, it's becoming more acceptable for a family to move in with their parents for a time. But generally, the goal is to leave as soon as they can. Let's go back to their culture. In their culture, you would get married and bring your wife back to the family compound, and you would still all live together. It wouldn't be until the patriarchal father passed away would the oldest son then get the traditional family home, and his family would take possession of the family house. The oldest son would then get a double portion of the inheritance, and he would use that to help the others establish their own homes, and the process would start over. So today, while you have older men living alone, these are men who either never married, are divorced, or are widowed. That wouldn't happen at the time of Christ. That individual would still live in the family household, which would consist of the mother, if she were still alive, any single sisters, daughters-in-law, and or granddaughters. The point here being that you generally would not see a household consisting of a single man. That was not very common. So, if these are their customs, maybe that is not our answer. This why becomes a little more difficult. Why would a man live in a household without women? The only reasonable answer to this, when you take into account their customs, are that men would not have women in their household if they were living in a monastery. Let's delve into this a little deeper and use that as our answer for the third why. The fourth why. Why would a man live in a monastery during the 1st century in Jerusalem? To answer this, let's ask another question. Have you ever been to Qumran? If you go to the Holy Land and take pretty much any commercial tour, they will almost always go to Qumran. Qumran is best known as the place where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. A Jewish sect called the Essenes separated themselves near the Dead Sea and practiced Judaism as they interpreted it. They had their copies of the scriptures, and as the Romans narrowed in on them, they hid their scriptures in caves and fled. They figured that after the Roman issue resolved itself, they would return and get the scriptures. They didn't know at the time that they would never return. These scriptures were found by a Bedouin sheep herder who was trying to find some lost sheep. They originally didn't understand what they had found and sold some of the scrolls on the black market. These scrolls are the oldest set of scriptures of the Old Testament to be found. Included in these scrolls are all the books of the Old Testament, with the exception of the book of Esther, because the name of God was not found in the scroll, as well as some other fascinating scrolls describing the beliefs of the Essenes. This particular sect was known for their celibacy and living in voluntary poverty. There were very seldom any women in their communes. This is also a reason why the community struggled going forward. Hard to maintain your society without women. Now, this particular group of Essenes were located by the Dead Sea, but were there any Essenes living in Jerusalem at the time of Christ? Another common location of Holy Land tours is to take you to a place called the Cenacle. Have you ever been to the Cenacle? This building is the traditional place of the Last Supper. It is often referred to as the upper room. If you've ever been to the Cenacle, did you notice what is in the lower room? Though not as popular to Christian tourists, this is a holy place for Jews. The lower room contains the traditional place of David's tomb. The Christian tourists all go to the upper room, while the Jewish tourists all go to the lower room. But you know what else is in the same area as the Cenacle? Shown is a picture of 1st century Jerusalem. In the lower corner on the first wall surrounding the city is what is called the Gate of the Essenes. This is in fact part of what is called the Essene Quarter, and right above that is David's tomb. So that is where Christ apparently held the Last Supper. It was in the Essene Quarter. So if Christ told Peter and John to follow the man which took him to the Cenacle, He would have had been in the midst of the Essenes, and the Essenes would have had a man carry their water. The Last Supper would have taken place in the midst of the Essenes, which leads to our final why. The fifth why. Why would the Essenes have observed the Passover meal? What customs did they have, and how does that impact the timing of Christ's Last Supper? The fifth why should tie everything together and identify our root cause. In the century before Christ was born, the Essene sect believed that the Jews had fallen into apostasy, and that the Jewish practices at the temple were not consistent with the temple worship of the first or Solomon's temple. They believed that when the Jews returned from Babylon, they brought with them Babylonian culture and polluted their religion. The Essene beliefs tried to restore these lost Jewish beliefs. This departure not only included temple worship, but also concepts of cleanliness and daily worship, as well as their calendar. We are familiar with the Jewish calendar. The Jewish days started at sundown and lasted until sundown the next day. Every week, the seventh day was considered to be a Sabbath day. Besides these weekly days, they observed other Sabbath days as well. One day that was observed as a Sabbath day was the monthly occurrence of the new moon. Now, the Jewish calendar did not calculate the days of the phases of the moon. The new moon could only be identified by visual observation. Once the new moon was seen, the shofar trumpets would sound and the new moon Sabbath would commence. This all works very fine until it becomes cloudy. What happens when the cloud cover prevents the observation of the new moon? Due to the clouds, they would send runners to different parts surrounding Jerusalem and sound shofar horns when someone observed the new moon. However, if the cloud cover was severe, it might take a day or two for it to clear enough to see the new moon. This holy day may have been postponed a day or two from the usual schedule. The Essenes believed that the Jews brought this calendar back from Babylon. They believed that anciently the new day began not at sundown, but at sunrise. So the Essenes changed their calendar so each day began at sunrise and not sundown. This means the Essene day would begin about 12 hours before the Jewish day. Also, they identified the new moon through calculations, like it is done today. They didn't have to wait until the new moon was observed. Because of the different calendaring system, the Essenes would have observed the holy days the day before the Jews observed them, and if there had been strong cloud cover at the time of the new moon, the Essenes could have observed the holy days even 2 or possibly 3 days before the Jews would have. So let's apply this to what happened at the Last Supper. John states, "And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand." That is John 11:55. Notice how it says, quote, "the Jews' Passover," unquote. If John is correct, then the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand. But if the Last Supper had been in the Essene quarter, which tradition states that they were, then the Essenes would have celebrated the Passover meal a day or two before the Jews did. If that is the case, then Christ could have celebrated a Passover meal with the Essenes, and the Jews would have celebrated it a day or so later. So the synoptic gospel writers are correct. It really was a Passover meal, just like they said. And in fact, John is correct as well. The Jews celebrated it at the time that Christ was crucified. So John is also correct. And with this, we have found the root cause. We can now state they were both correct. The synoptic gospels tell of the timing of an Essene Passover meal, but John refers to a Jewish Passover meal, which occurred at the time when Christ was crucified. By understanding the customs of the day and not assuming that there was only one group of people celebrating the Passover meal, the ambiguity is now resolved, and hopefully a paradigm shift has occurred. Today we just accept some core things as true. One of these is our calendar. We all know today's current day, month, and year, and everyone else knows and accepts this as well. But we often fail to realize that other cultures didn't have the same assumption as we have today. Other cultures didn't have just one calendar. They could have people living among them that used different calendars. And isn't that what happens to us even today? Why does the day we celebrate Easter change year to year? Every year Passover occurs on the same day, Nisan 15, every year. It's on the Jewish calendar, same day every year. It's just when you convert their lunar calendar to our solar calendar that our dates bounce around. It's always the same day on their calendar. So who's correct, us or the Jews? And the answer is the same. We are both correct. It's just measured differently. This has all been a lot of fun, but what does it mean for us? How can we apply this today? First and foremost, we shouldn't be so vain to believe that our customs, our calendar, our beliefs are superior to theirs. Something that is a given to us today may have been different back then. Even when it comes to things like the calendar, have you ever heard the question or watched a video on or held a discussion that asked, what day was Jesus born? If you watch 5 videos on that, then you'll probably get 5 different answers. Interestingly, if you believe the Book of Mormon, then that is an easy answer. 3 Nephi 2 and 8 says, Now the Nephites began to reckon their time from this period when the sign was given, or from the coming of Christ. Therefore 9 years had passed away. So they reckoned their new year on the day Christ was born, and the first Jewish month is Nisan. Then the Book of Mormon calendar was that Christ was born on Nisan 1. But how can we convert that to our calendar? Fortunately, we know from previous discussion that Christ died when they sacrificed the lambs, which is Nisan 14. 3 Nephi 8 verse 5 says, And it came to pass in the 34th year, in the first month, on the 4th day of the month, there arose a great storm, such an one as never had been known in all the land. So on the Book of Mormon calendar, the Jewish Nisan 14 was 4 days after Christ's birth. So using the Jewish calendar, Christ was then born on Nisan 10, which was Palm Sunday. Did you know that Palm Sunday was Christ's birthday? The problem in converting this back to our calendar is we don't know what year it was. You can go back through and make an argument for pretty much every year from our current calendaring system from about 7 BC to 3 AD. So we still don't know what day it is on our calendar, but we do know it was Palm Sunday on the Jewish calendar, and that date moves around every year on our calendar. We have to be careful about the assumptions we make. We assume that we are this know-it-all people. If you're a little humble, it's amazing what you can learn in the Bible and the Book of Mormon from this backward society. They knew things that we don't know today. Be humble, ask questions, and be open to answers. What do we know? We do know that God lives and that He loves us. May we be ready when He comes again. Have your face towards Zion.